we're going to take a look at the dimensions of celebration, communion, and transformation when it comes to the Eucharist. We've said this before, and I've picked on poor Kevin Baker a few times about it, but it's really important to emphasize that when we celebrate Eucharist, we are remembering what Jesus did for us in his Paschal mystery, but we're not just remembering it. We're participating in it. We're participating in the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. We're made present to it in the Eucharist. We experience that life and salvation in the present moment. We experience the offer of Christ, of himself to us every time. And so we're not actually reliving in that we would be like re-sacrificing Christ. He's not being killed every time we have Mass. But we are becoming present to those events in a really powerful and mystical way every time we celebrate Mass. Jesus continues to offer himself to us each time. The Mass is, the Eucharist is always in the form of a Mass, and that is a form of liturgy, which is the public work of the Church. And I love this concept of like going to Mass is actually work. It's our job as people, as believers. Our job is to worship, to participate in what the Catechism calls the work of God. And so it's our job. It's what we do. It's our work. Yet another reason why Mass doesn't have to be entertainment, because it's work. And it can be really hard sometimes. But it's important, essential work that's good for us and allows us to participate in God's work. As in all work, there are different roles for different people. In the Mass, of course, the priest or the bishop, we talked about it, stands in persona Christi, representing Christ. And each member of the assembly has a role, including lectors, gift bearers, Eucharistic ministers. But the most important role for everybody, regardless of ordained or lay, is that all people participate fully, consciously, and actively in the Mass. That's our job. That comes from the document Sacrosanctum Concilium, section 14. This is an important document on the Eucharist and the liturgy from Vatican II. In class, we're going to take a look at the parts of the Mass, so that you will come to know the order of the Mass and the reason behind all the different parts of the ritual that we do. You may not have realized this, but there are some requirements to receive communion. First, spiritually, that people are, quote, properly disposed or in a state of grace, meaning that you are spiritually ready to receive the Eucharist. And this is something that's not anything new. This is coming all the way back from St. Paul to the Corinthians in the very early church, where Paul says, make an examination of conscience. Figure out where you stand with God before you receive Eucharist. And if you have a broken relationship with the church or with God, you shouldn't be receiving Eucharist. We actually believe that the Eucharist forgives minor or venial sins, they're called. But if you have sinned mortally, you're no longer in communion with the church and you're asked to receive penance or encouraged to receive the sacrament of reconciliation before you receive the Eucharist. And actually, for a time historically, the reception of the Eucharist went way down because people thought, well, if I've sinned at all, I'm not in communion with the church or with God, so I can't receive Eucharist. But when Eucharist started to become more frequent, people received penance much more frequently for that very reason. So it's not to say that you have to be perfect in order to receive Eucharist, but you should at least be respectful of the Eucharist enough to say, okay, maybe I need to go to confession before I need to receive Eucharist because I feel as though I have broken relationships with the church or with God. In addition to being properly disposed, or what's called in a state of grace, you're asked also to fast for 1 hour before receiving communion. Why? Because, well, maybe the physical hunger symbolizes our spiritual hunger for Christ. And so you can feel that kind of like nourishment on both levels, spiritual and physical. It's kind of a cool idea. As far as communion, the graces that you receive from Eucharist. The Catechism calls them fruits of participation in the Eucharist and identifies 4. Unity with Christ, which you receive like physically as Christ, the real presence of Christ enters your body. Separation from sin, because we believe the Eucharist forgives venial sin. Becoming church, because we say we become what we receive. We become more fully the body of Christ when we receive the body of Christ in the Eucharist. And the Eucharist is the summit of our Christian life. So it is like what we are supposed to be as church, celebrating together, sharing a meal in worship and praise, and gathering together, uniting ourselves to each other and to Christ. And then finally, the 4th grace being Eucharist for others. And this really is like the transformation piece, ties in with the transformation dimension of the sacrament, that we not only are fed in the Eucharist, we are called to go out and to feed other people. And especially here, we're going to focus on the works of mercy. And that's what we do in order to feed others. And we're going to look at the textbook for a couple of pages just so you get a better handle on these graces. We'll look at those in class. And finally, transformation. As I mentioned, we're called, once we receive and we're nourished by the word and the sacrament in the Eucharist, we're called to go out and to nourish others. As on page 135 in our book says, be the bread that others need. And you'll notice the very last thing that the priest or the deacon at church, depending on whether or not the deacon is present, will say to you is, go in peace, glorifying the Lord by your life, meaning your life should be giving glory to that God that you just received in the Eucharist. And so the Eucharist demands much of us. It's very challenging that we're called to not to go just to Mass for ourselves. Receiving Eucharist is not about me. Ultimately, it's about me being recharged spiritually and reunited with Christ in a way that sends me forth into the world to be that Christ for others. And in fact, Mass comes from the Latin word missio, which means to be sent. We are sent out by Christ to do his will, to be his body, to be the bread that others need. As St. John Paul II said, or Pope St. John Paul II, I guess would be the official title, said, when we celebrate Eucharist, we become, quote, a sacrament for humanity, for the redemption of all, meaning that lowercase s type of sacrament that we've discussed. That when we receive Eucharist, we should then become sacramental for others. People should experience Christ through us. So that's another reason why the weekly obligation from the precepts, the weekly obligation to go to Mass is so important in our faith life, because it's not just about us. It's about us being turned into that body of Christ in a new way for those around us who are in need.